Me and two buddies was hunting for elk and had set up camp alongside a state park. Early morning, we guys were standing around a fire, talking, and getting ready to have some breakfast. Afterwards, we all got up, got ready to head off down towards a very popular game trail towards one of our several stands. This was in the early morning. It was beautiful outside. There's nothing like fresh morning air. It's so crisp. And I remember the morning so well. The sky was blue. There were even few clouds in the sky. It was out, and the water was just sparkling, crystal clear over the pond. The birds were singing in the trees, and an occasional squirrel leaping from branch to branch. And then there was all those green leaves swaying in the breeze that had just started to turn yellow and gold from fall. We had all been walking for about an hour into the woods when we started to hear a sound. It was like somebody else's voice, just murmuring in the trees and over the water. We all kept looking at each other and exchanging glances, slowing down and listening closely. Then it would stop. We walked in silence for several more moments, and we'd hear it again. We could not quite place where the sounds were coming from, whether that be to the left or right, ahead or behind, above or below. It sounded as if it was coming from everywhere. This time, it became more clear, and began to sound like whispering or mumbling in some strange language we did not understand. The longer we walked, the louder the sounds got. And now, the tone of this murmuring began to sound angry. Then, the birds stopped singing, and every once in a while, you could still hear that strange language being muttered from somewhere deep inside these remote woods. All four of us were beginning to sweat from being so nervous. I could see the other guys were beginning to get very uncomfortable, but we kept walking towards our stand. Finally, after about another hour of walking, so now we're up to about 2 hours at this point, we come up to our first stand, and my buddy Scott stopped us. Looking down in the soil, you could see a large footprint, a print we did not recognize. It was clawed and strange looking. If you looked, you could see what made out to be 3 toes, and large claws set on each one. It had to have been easily 400 to 500 pounds, judging by the indentation into the dirt. We did not see a secondary print along with it, just a single step. We all looked at each other like, is this for real? What could leave such a print? A bear? No, not this deep. Those claws were huge. It was like nothing we ever saw before. We all agreed that it would be best to move a little bit more into the trees and brush, up over a hill in the distance to the second stand. This definitely made things creepy. The sun was just starting to come up as we're walking up the hill. The timber around us was very, very thick, and we could not see very far out. About another hour had passed, and we're still talking about what that print most likely was. And my buddy Joe stopped and let out a loud yell. He had saw something. He was pointing at something straight ahead, up in the trees. As we all looked, what we saw was the most terrifying thing I have ever laid my eyes on. It was several feet tall and clutched to the trees, like some sort of freak of nature. It looked like a darn spider or something, but also very distinctly human. It turned to look at us and made this horrifying grin. It reminded me if you crossed a human and a spider together. I can't even describe it. He just screamed, "Run," and we turned and ran as fast as we could. This thing being behind us let out a screech like no other. We ran as fast as we could with all of our equipment on, and were hauling it back in the direction we came. We stopped after about 10 minutes to try and catch our breath, and the rest of the hike back to camp was silent. Nobody said a word. It didn't sound like this thing was following us, but we did not stop until we made it back to camp, where we were several miles away. Hunting for us just wasn't in the cards that day. When we got back to camp, we could hear this loud, eerie howling coming from the area behind the other side of the lake, nearby. We never went back to our stands, and we've been too scared to share this with anybody. I'm curious if there's been anybody else who's had a similar sighting or experience that they would like to share. we'd love to hear them. Maybe we can figure out what happened that day. I generally am not one to talk about this kind of stuff, but I can't refute what happened this day back in September of 2013. For starters, I wouldn't call myself an avid outdoorsman, but I do enjoy to camp quite a bit, and I hike a lot. I would like to think of myself as in pretty good shape. I try to stay as physical as possible, using the elliptical and the treadmill when I'm not hiking. I enjoy being able to hike 5 to 10 miles at a time, so I try to stay in tip-top shape. Even though, by many standards, that is nowhere near tip-top shape, but I hope you get the point. Anyway, my friend is the same way, and we often consider each other hiking buddies. We've hiked in many places and done many things, so the story I'm about to share with you is really the only time we've had a weird experience, seeing something we cannot explain. Before I mention the story, I'll also say that we've never seen weird tracks or a Bigfoot or anything like that. No UFO phenomenon, none of that stuff. While I have heard many eyewitness reports of that kind of thing, I never have experienced such bizarre things. But this sighting that I'm going to share with you definitely would fit into that category. Alright, so anyway, we had just made a camp and just made our fire. He just finished setting up his tent, and I was sitting there, pulling out the beef jerky. We were talking about something that I don't remember, and he kind of looks off in the distance and has this weird look on his face, and he says, "Hey, what animal is that?" And we both look over, and we see this long white figure running off on the hillside in the distance. Now, quick note, all around us is thick timber. To the right of us, off where we're looking, the land dips down, and a small hill. There's a creek. The land dips down, a small hill, to a very small creek. This is where we get our water from. Then the land ascends back up a larger hill, up to more timber. Between us, the creek, and the other part of the timber is a large clearing, or a meadow. There's maybe a tree here and there, but for the most part it's pretty open. And that morning as we were setting up camp, there was a big bull elk just sitting out there. It's quite beautiful. So when this thing comes trotting out into the clearing, it sticks out like a sore thumb against the bright green background of the grass. And I think ultimately when my friend saw it, he points to it, I look, and I see this strange thing. And I'm thinking to myself, what the? And I stand up too to get a better look. And now my friend and I are just staring at it. I'll describe it to you as best I can. It was like a person walking on all fours, but now take them, make them naked, make them stark white, and have really long arms and legs. It was bizarre looking, and the way it walked was like if somebody had crab walked or something. It was very, very strange. We see it walk from one part of the clearing, come to about the middle, stop, and sit there, like a statue, perfectly still, then turn and venture off into the other portion of the clearing, up north. Then it was gone. We kind of just looked at each other trying to figure out what we just saw, but none of us really had the answers. It didn't really creep us out as much as it confused us. Although, after about 20 minutes of conversation about it, we kind of forgot about it, went on about our normal day. We never had any experience like this ever again. I have quite the scary story to share. My boyfriend and I had gone camping. This was several years ago. We are still together. We got to our camp spot, set everything up, and the night itself went pretty smoothly. However, right as we were turning in for bed, my boyfriend and I got into a very huge fight, a very heated argument. It resulted in him storming out of the tent, and he told me, "Fine, I'll just sleep in the truck," which we were so pissed off at each other. I thought, whatever, fine, be that way. So I slept in the comfort of the tent. But it's not like it was cold outside. This was in late June, so it was pretty comfortable. I think he just laid down the seat or something. I don't know. Don't really care. I woke up at about 1:30 in the morning. I checked my phone, and I just had this feeling in the pit of my stomach. I should probably go check on him. Maybe a part of me just somehow felt sorry for the guy. I don't know. I get up out of my sleeping bag, go outside the tent, and the cab light is on. Huh, that's strange. I go up to the window and knock on it. But something's wrong. He's sitting there shaking, and his eyes are wide. He's also very pale. Now I open the door and I ask, "What's going on? Are you okay?" And he slowly turns to me. The dude looks like he's seen a flipping tornado. He shakes his head no, and you could tell he's terrified by something. He quickly grabs me, pulls me in the cab of the truck, closes the door and locks it. Now I'm beginning to get very concerned. What's wrong? Why are you freaking out? He pauses, looks back at me. This is the most scared I've ever seen him, and he's still trembling. He asks me, "Is it out there?" I didn't see it. And I'm saying, "What are you talking about? What do you mean, is it out there? I have no idea what you're talking about." He puts his finger over my mouth to a shh motion, and he says, "Listen." I couldn't hear anything. And he says, "Exactly. There's no crickets, nothing." So I tell him, "You're beginning to scare me. What's going on?" But he doesn't say anything. He just makes us stay quiet. And after maybe about 30 seconds, he jumps over me, pushes me into the passenger side seat, turns the truck on. The headlights go on. He puts the car into drive and drives off. And I'm thinking, what are you doing? Are you crazy? We can't just leave all of our supplies back there. What's going on? And he doesn't say a word. He gets maybe 5-6 miles and just stops the car in the middle of the road, puts it in park, and just sits there and turns very slowly towards me. And he says in the most calm voice, something, I don't know what it was, a skeleton or something, tapped on the glass, tried to get in the truck, was pulling on the cab doors, then stops. I'm thinking to myself, okay, you're obviously spooked by something, maybe you had a bad dream. But he immediately became emotionally very irrational, said no, this was not a dream. Whatever this was looked like some sort of demon, not a bear, not a wolf, not a dog, not a raccoon, a fox, nothing. And it was trying to get into the cab of the truck. My boyfriend isn't one to prank me like this or make up stories. He was genuinely petrified. I mean, the man was trembling and white. You can just see the genuine fear pouring out of him, like such a raw emotion. I didn't really know what to say or do, but just try my best to comfort him. Clearly he had seen something that spooked him. I didn't say anything for a while, and just held on. Maybe a couple minutes go by and I asked him if he wanted to go rent a hotel, which is what we did. We came back in the morning, once there was plenty of sunlight. We came back and got all of our supplies, including our tent, everything. That was the end of that camping trip, and still by far the most spookiest, scariest thing I could ever imagine. Although now if I ask him about it, he doesn't like to talk about it or answer questions on it, so I still don't know for sure what he saw. But whatever it was, it clearly traumatized him. I had gone camping with my family up on Little Deer Creek on Forest Road 1820. This is also right in the Finney Creek area on the Skagit Valley. This was in the spring of 2011. Now, where I was at is completely surrounded by a lot of forest. To my south is full of thick cedar and fir, intermixed with some alder. This is also an amazing place to go fishing, since I've been here before several times and have gone fishing for trout, many times in the same area. But as I was passing a portion of a small bridge that crosses the creek, I got this feeling like I was not alone. I was with my family, but they were not with me on the small little hike. They were back at camp. I was alone entirely, but I could feel that something else was in the woods with me. Now, I'm not going to say it was a monster, but maybe it was somebody stalking me. I don't know. You know that feeling you get in the pit of your stomach, where you feel like you're in danger? Well, that's what that was. And my first thing that came to mind was I'm going to get jumped and murdered out here. That there's some crazy axe-wielding murderer just waiting behind the trees, waiting for the right moment to strike. I kept looking around but didn't see anything, so I kind of just brushed it off and thought it would be best for me to head back to camp. I was only about 3 miles from camp, so I walked all of it very briskly. Even though it was springtime, This particular day was very warm, like May days are. I tried to do my best to follow the creek, just to make sure that I was safe. I don't know if following a creek makes you safer automatically, but it made me feel safer, because I feel if anything happened, the creek will always lead you to the right place. I always grew up knowing that. After getting back to my camp, finally, the feeling subsided, and I did not go out on my own for the rest of that entire trip. Maybe it was just a feeling, but I've never just been out in the woods by myself and felt like I wasn't alone. Always trust your gut instinct. Always. Four Boy Scouts on a backpacking trip in Wyoming's Wind River Range were exploring the shores of Junction Lake at twilight, when suddenly they saw something in the trees to their left. They say this: "We started hearing this sound that was like somebody moaning," one of the scouts said. "It was super eerie. And the noise kept getting closer. It became clear that there was more than one thing moving toward them. Then they saw the silhouette of a tall man-like figure walk out of the woods, straight across the meadow, right in front of them. He didn't look human at all," recalls another scout named Alex. "At first, he looked really bulky. Then his arms kind of dragged behind him. We could see his torso. It was all black. We couldn't see any face at all, due to how dark out it was, but it scared us. It disappeared in the shadows. The boys went home after that. The next morning, they went back to search for evidence, but ultimately found nothing. Although they saw something unexplained that night. None of them believe in cryptids or Bigfoot, or any other paranormal explanations. I'm not really sure what we saw," says Alex, "but I know it was not human. It did not act like any animal we've ever seen before." I feel like my story is one that defies all odds. You see, I'm quite aware of everything that exists in the animal kingdom, or so I thought. I always thought we were the top predator. Well, underneath a few things, maybe like sharks and bears and lions and whatnot. But this day would prove me entirely wrong. It would prove to me there's something far beyond humans. Far beyond any other predatory animal that exists, actually. I'll tell you about that now. So, me and a good friend of mine, we were camping in Yosemite National Park. We were staying for 6 days and 6 nights. Everything was pretty much your standard protocol. We'd get up, hike around most of the day, come back, eat dinner, relax, go to bed. We did this the entire time. However, on the 5th day, we hiked into a different section of the park we'd never had before. And, like usual, we like to go off trail. I feel like we get to see more and experience more the park has to offer than just the standard trails, even though many of the rangers say it's a big no-no. We were more on the reckless side, however. What we did probably wasn't safe, but, well, that's what you get with 2 young men in their 20s who are starving for adventure. After starting up a small rocky incline, we're now probably 3 or 4 miles off the nearest trail, and we come upon a very, very disturbing sight. Just so you know, to my knowledge, there's nothing in the known animal kingdom that can do what we saw. But there it was. I have to assume it was another bear, but to my knowledge, bears do not kill other bears like this. We found an adult male grizzly bear, torn in half. I'm not talking about like killed by another bear and eaten on. I'm talking physically torn from about the midsection, completely in half, as if some sort of giant had grabbed one end of each of the bear and ripped it completely in half. You could see where its innards had completely spilled out all over the rock, and the flesh was torn. The bear looked like it did not even stand a chance. My friend and I just stood there completely shocked and baffled at what we were seeing. It was truly a sight to behold. I don't even think we said anything for a good 2-3 minutes before we both started walking around trying to investigate what would kill an adult male grizzly bear. It had to have been an adult male. I mean, this was a very, very large brown bear. So I have no way to prove it was a grizzly, but I'm pretty sure brown bear don't get this big. And if you Google a grizzly bear, it pretty much fits right in line with the size and everything else. My friend looked at it a little more closely. I was a little bit more disturbed by all the blood and gore. He's always been more of the analytical one, and he thought that the way the flesh was torn was very interesting. He noted that it seemed to be by force, as if something grabbed this thing and literally tore the bear in half. The way the flesh will thin and begin to tear. That's exactly the way this looked. One other thing he made note of is that there were no other wounds on this bear. There were no claw marks or any sort of bloody marks, indicating a fight, meaning that it probably wasn't in a fight with another bear, or wolves, since I know they're here. But I know wolves will also bite at the back legs. There was no indications that there was any bite marks on the back legs. No blood, nothing. Just from being torn in half and this middle section being ripped open. There were also no signs at all of this bear having been eaten on, meaning that whatever killed it had not tried to eat it or anything, just simply killed it as is where it stood and left. We quickly scouted in the nearby 10-20 feet around the bear. Nothing. There was no flattened grass, no signs of a disturbance or a fight. Usually soil is upturned and it will look like there was some sort of standoff. Nothing. It's as if something large picked up this bear, tore it in half, set it down here, and left. There was no footprints, no tracks, nothing. We just sat there, completely horrified, disturbed, confused, thinking, what out here is going to kill a grizzly bear, rip it in half without any sort of bite marks, eating, anything, and leave it? The kill looked somewhat fresh, maybe in the last 12 hours. There were no flies buzzing around it, so I don't know if that has anything to do with the time of date or the time of kill. This was about noon. It was roughly 70-75 degrees outside. We got back down to camp, which took us a little longer than usual. We immediately told a park ranger, and they just informed us they would go check it out and take care of it. We obviously never heard anything back about it, and we didn't want to. The following day, we went and did another hike in a separate area of the park, and that was pretty much the end of that. Then to this day, I still try and speculate what killed that bear and why. Nothing adds up. Nothing makes sense. My family and I would try and go camping just about every summer, like many other traditional North American families. So, this was when I was a teenager. I was roughly 14, if I'm remembering correctly. I was with 2 close friends. We were all in our own tent. Oh, and by the way, this was in the Rockefeller State Park Reserve. So, I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on a backstory or pointless, useless information. We'll get right to it. On the first night, I woke up to go use the bathroom. So, I step out of the tent and, kind of in a half daze of sleep and being awake, stumble to a tree, maybe 15 feet away. I whip it out and begin peeing. Well, about halfway through my stream, I notice these 2 glowing yellow lights. But I'm trying to look at them and trying to make out what they could be, and I believe they're eyes, and they're just kind of swaying back and forth, as if whoever they belong to is drunk, or that's what the movement reminded me of. They were maybe about 70 feet away and slowly coming toward me. Instantly, I had this really bad feeling come over me. It was like complete and total dread, just sitting in the pit of my stomach. I cut myself off, almost about 3/4 of my stream, zipped up, and I ran back to that tent so fast. You might as well call me Usain Bolt. Surprisingly, my friends didn't wake up. They sleep like rocks. I mean, there could have been a hurricane, Category 5, and they would have been snoring away. I sat there, awake for what felt like hours afterwards, terrified by what I saw. There's no animal I know that matches that description. The eyes were pretty high off the ground, and the area in which I was looking was a small meadow not too far away. During the daytime, there's about 2 trees there, and we're not too far away from Swan Lake. My problem here with the whole thing of people debunking that it might be a deer or a bear is that generally for eyes to glow like that, there has to be light being shined into them to reflect, to give it that sort of illusion. There was no light coming from anywhere. It was pretty dark. I mean, sure, we did have an LED lantern, probably about 30 feet away off to my left, but there's no way that that would have caused that much of a glow in whatever animals this was eyes that were roughly almost 100 feet away. I mean, they were eerily glowing. It reminded me of some sort of Halloween prop. That's why it freaked me out so much. And it was moving, slowly towards me, in my direction. Nothing ever happened the rest of the night. I eventually fell asleep and that was the end of that. Never mentioned it to my friends or family. Nobody ever mentioned anything to me. Anyway, just wanted to share my own creepy camping experience. Have a great day, and a safe October. My sighting takes place around halfway between Cody and Yellowstone, where my friend and I noticed something staring at us off in the distance. It was down a slope in a clearing, moving very slowly. In fact, it was the movement that caught our attention. When we saw the creature, we realized right away that this was not a person. It was too large, far too bulky, and covered in long matted hair, the same way a bear's had. Except when bears walk on two legs, they don't walk this comfortably. The gait was different too. It was also roughly 8 to 9 feet, if measured appropriately, and was anywhere between 120 to 150 yards away. It was moving from southwest to northwest, so we saw the back side of it, and also part of the side, much the same way the creature looked in the Patterson and Gimli film. It was also very wide and very broad in build. My cousin is actually a biologist, who I told him about this encounter, and he's not exactly sure what this was. I think he briefly entertained the idea of a Bigfoot, but to him, that's all nonsense. I think he believes it's just a misidentification of a bear. But I'm telling you, I've seen and hunted bear for years. I know what they do. I know what they look like, and I know what they look like when they're walking on two legs. This was no way a bear. It looked like a large person, to be honest, with a huge fur coat on, and a more cone-shaped head. No neck at all. Very broad shoulders. I don't want to go off the rails and say that this was a Bigfoot, but it was definitely a very interesting sighting. Now, after about an hour or two after the sighting, we were still in the area, and we heard some wood knocking off in the distance. I almost wonder if that was caused by whatever this was. I'm no Bigfoot expert by any means, but part of me can't help but pinpoint these two things together. I don't know if this detail is important, but there was also some elk bugles earlier that day. They seemed to stop and quiet down after the sighting of whatever this was. I went hiking all alone by myself, out in the great woods. This wasn't in any national forest or anything, just a large section of woods, far off the beaten path where or near my property. There's just something about going camping out by yourself where you feel so at touch and at peace with nature. If you're a nature bug like me, you'll understand what I mean. I had just gotten a fire going. It was around 4 or 5 p.m. at this point. Not quite dusk yet, but getting there. I got the impression that I was no longer alone. I could feel a presence around me, but could not see anybody else nearby. It wasn't like the feeling that it was anything evil, just somebody watching me. I heard a branch snapping, and I thought I'd go to check it out, but I didn't see anything around. Now, I sat back down by the fire, and it remained quiet for quite some time. I kind of got lost in my own thoughts, as the woods often makes me do. 4 p.m. quickly became 5. 5 became 6, and 6 became 7. It had stayed very quiet the entire time, and I could not shake the feeling that somebody was looking at me. Although, after checking religiously, I never saw anybody, saw any eyes or any animals nearby. I thought it was very odd. So at one point or another, I decided to just retire for the night. After setting up my tent, I just laid there in my sleeping bag, tried to doze off to sleep, forget it all. It was a very uncomfortable night. It did not take very long for me to realize that I was not going to be asleep. The feeling and awareness of something watching me was still very much there. So I finally got up and decided I would go looking for whatever it was. Nothing seemed strange or out of place necessarily. As I was looking around, though, I could feel multiple sets of eyes on me. At least that's how it felt. Now, this only lasted for a few moments, and I heard what sounded like somebody really big running away from my direction. I was very frightened at the time, but couldn't see anything out of place. There's no way it could have been a man, as I would have seen him from left to right after the noise. There was no way of telling how long this person or thing had been watching me, the thing that I never saw. It's safe to say I didn't fall asleep till very late that night. I think from now on, I'll probably just stick to camping with other people that I know, or go during the day at least. Who knows what kind of wildlife may have been watching me. We had just established base camp at the base of the mountain. This was right before dark, so we wanted to make sure everything was set up properly before visibility got too poor. My cousins who were with me were not so outdoor savvy like I. They had been complaining the entire time. One of the reasons I was so thankful for this trip was over is to hear them finally shut up. Our camp was settled on a small bluff that was backed up by 3 sides of very thick brush. The right area in front of our tents was clear enough to set up a campfire for the night. I suggested we go down to a nearby creek so they can cool off for about 30 minutes later, and they had returned cleaned and refreshed, or as clean and refreshed as you can. We talked and chit-chatted for a little bit around the fire, ate snacks and told stories. You know, all the usual stuff you do. Then we said our goodbyes, went goodnight, and got into the tent to get ready for bed. At this point, it was roughly 8 or 9 p.m. I decided I was going to take a walk around the camp and check things out. As I walked toward the creek, maybe 150 yards from our own campsite, the same creek that my cousins earlier went and washed up at, I heard what sounded like something very large moving slowly through the brush. For some reason, it didn't sound like a deer or anything on 4 legs. It sounded like a person who was very heavy moving. After making sure it wasn't my cousins messing with me, I moved towards the sounds more and more. Whoever this was going more left to right and not back. As I got closer to the creek bed, I saw what looked like a very large man coming out and standing on a large rock, about to cross the stream. What I saw did not look anywhere near human, as it had too much hair and was far too tall and big. I didn't see a face because of how dark it was, but I could tell by its motion and body language. It saw me as I saw it through the brush, now roughly 30 to 40 feet away. As far as I can tell, it seemed to be startled as much as I was by first seeing it. We kind of just looked at each other there, and it suddenly bolted off. I was spooked by this, but I quickly retreated, hastily, back to camp, not saying a word and trying my best to forget about it. I climbed in my tent, not saying a word. The following day, we had to hike down to the river. There was also one place we found a lot of blood and bits of fur and even clothes lying there. Very odd. We decided not to look too much into it. My cousins were already on edge. However, it was on our way back down the mountain when we made camp again, and I heard something in the woods stop us dead in our tracks. Now, my cousins were terrified. I just listened to confirm that it wasn't them just being scared little girls. It started again, this time louder, screaming and tree crashing followed by, and it sounded much closer. I decided to take some action this time, and boy, did that really get my cousins moving. This was enough to really scare them, so we did a double time back down the mountainside into the timber below. I can't say for sure what I saw that night, or what kind of animal it could have been, but I know for a fact this was not a bear or a human in any way, shape, or form. I know that for a fact. I'm just thankful my cousins never saw it, although they had heard the noises which really scared them. I'll admit, it scared me too. I still go back to that area and hunt in the fall time. Haven't heard or seen anything like that since. I hope I never. My wife and I were camped out in a campground in the Indiana State Forest. The day itself had gone great. We had already made friends with several people in the camp and started a bonfire in the pit. After having dinner, we all decided to go exploring in the woods for a bit. I was walking with my wife and another couple, and we came upon a cave entrance. The others were intrigued, so we went inside. It wasn't very big as far as caverns go, but it was for fun, and my wife and I liked to explore a little bit. She even took some pictures of me standing in some of the chambers. Then we went back out to rejoin the others. When we got back outside, we noticed that her camera was now missing. She asked me if I had it, and I said no. We both knew there was no way she could have dropped it inside without us seeing, and none of them had taken it. There was also not much light in the cave, so the only explanation was they did not want us to find something or see something. Luckily, it was just a crappy little Kodak disposable camera, not like it was an expensive DSLR or anything. We just counted our losses, continued on with the evening. We continued on with our newfound friends to a meeting spot in the woods and made s'mores from the fire pit there. After a while, we stopped talking, turning our attention toward the clear sky. After some much-needed conversation and company, we counted our goodbyes and went to bed. Now, we had gone to bed and I woke up to use the bathroom. I walked outside our tent, down the path a few feet, turned and saw something standing there, blocking my way to the camping area. It, because it was not a person, was 6 feet tall. It looked like it weighed about 250 pounds. It was this dirty gray color, long arms and a very pig boar type face and nose. I was frozen in fear, and it looked at me for about 10 seconds, and then turned around and casually walked off. I tried to wake my wife up so we could pack up and leave, but she had drinking quite a bit of wine before bedtime and was very, very out. I ended up staying awake most of the night for fear of it coming back. Well, just a few days later, I told my wife that I saw something out in the woods. She told me she had been seeing the same thing nights ago in the woods when she was walking back to our tent. She said it just looked at her but didn't do anything. It turned around and too walked off. She was afraid to speak up. I can't believe she saw the same thing I did and did not call me crazy. I guess the real question is, what did we see? In the fall of 2014, my family and I were camping in the national forest near Hot Springs, Arkansas. We had been going to this area for years now, no problems. The morning after arriving in our camp, my husband went out looking for firewood, while me and my children stayed back at camp, relaxing. My daughter was practicing her archery skills and asked if she can go stir up the fire to get it started. We didn't have to wait so long for the wood to burn before being able to do anything else. She left her bow on a chair by the picnic table, about 30 feet from where I was laying in the hammock between two trees reading a book. While stirring up the fire, she thought that she heard something walking into the woods and turning to look, but didn't see anything. She went back to the fire, cut up some parts of a tree limb that we had brought with us, and began to feed it in when she heard her bow fall. Knowing at all that she had not touched it since putting it there when she left to get the fire going. This made her ever more curious, so she walks over there to where she had put it down, found it laying on the ground about 5 feet away from the chair. She picked up her arrows and her bow, walked back towards camp, and just as our son came out of the camper, asking if anybody else could hear the weird noises in the woods. He could hear something really, really strange. My daughter told him to go get his bow, so he walked back around the camper and grabbed his compound bow as well. And now they were walking together. By this time, I had woken up from my nap that I had slowly dozed off from, asked where everybody was going, thinking they were just trying to scare me. They both replied that they thought the noise in the woods came from something very close by, and they really wanted to go check it out. I told them not to worry about how weird this sound was. They ran back to camp totally blank-faced and white. They told me in deep breaths. We saw it. It looked like a large hairy man was hiding behind the trees, and it scared them. The rest of the evening, they didn't do anything but sat there. I can tell it was pretty frightening for them. But my husband and I never saw anything. Nothing ever became of it, thankfully. Going back about 2 years ago, my friends and I had gone camping outside of Loveland, Ohio. This is a very old state park, built around the time of the Great Depression. It is also extremely secluded. No civilization for at least 3 to 4 miles if you drove to the entrance. We decided to camp at night, even though it had rained quite heavily during the week. We set up our tent on one side of a ravine so we could have some shelter from the heavy winds if they came up suddenly. At first, everything was fine, but as it got darker outside, things started to get strange. We would hear odd noises off in the distance, and at one point, one of my friends was almost certain that he had heard a scream. We kind of began to get freaked out and stayed in our tents for the majority of the night, contemplating why did we choose this location again. One friend had talked about how he heard that this place was haunted at one point or another. Either that, or they had done a massive amount of satanic cultic rituals, which would explain all the creepy noises and atmosphere. I can't validate that in any way, but it would make sense. This was a camping experience that was pretty spooky, to say the least. At one point, we had to get up and go use the restroom, which was just a nearby tree. The second you step outside, everything felt different. The atmosphere was thick, like you can cut it with a knife, and you just felt on edge like something was about to happen at any given moment. Although nothing did, it felt like you were being watched by 1,000 eyes all around you. So we had to go and take shifts on who could use the bathroom first. The night itself was pretty uneventful, thankfully, and in the morning, we packed everything up and moved on to a totally different camping spot. This was a no-go for future occurrences. 2019, the last summer before the pandemic, and before everything went strange and haywire. It's a time I'm sure we all remember very fondly. Well, I have a story of going camping out with a friend that I'm sure will spook you. This friend and I craved adventure, and we decided to go out climbing up a very steep, rocky incline. We had always wanted to see what was on top of the ridge. I mean, probably nothing exciting, but a tremendous view. Once we make our way, after about 20 minutes up to this ridge, there's blood everywhere. And I mean everywhere. All over the rocks. It looks like something splattered. And I don't mean enough blood that an animal was eaten and killed up here. I mean easily over 9 feet surface area. And it did not look that old. Maybe a couple days at most. Like maybe there had been a massacre up here or something. But other than the dried blood, there was no clothes, no hair, fur, bones, any sign that any animal or anything was even killed up here, other than the blood. We were pretty freaked out by this, so we decided to climb back down the ridge and head back to camp. We told his parents about it, and they kind of wrote it off and brushed it off as whatever, right? Typical parents. So the next day comes, and we decide to go up there again. Maybe we should explore and see if there's a cause for this. I mean, it was so out of place to have this much dried blood everywhere. So we climb all the way back up there, another 20 or so minutes. Now this time we get up there, and there's no trace of the blood ever being there. It was completely gone. And now my friend and I are questioning each other's sanity, saying, we just saw this yesterday, right? We were both here. We both witnessed it. And now it's as if the blood was never here in the first place. We're a little distraught by the fact that the blood's not here anymore, so we have no way to investigate what could have caused it. So we head back down the ridge, tell his parents the blood's not there anymore. And they completely don't believe us. They thought we're just trying to make the whole thing up, just to get a rise out of them. You know, get them to engage in our story. Which we just kind of figured, let's just stop talking to them because they don't believe us at all. Well, the second day passes, and the third day comes. And we get the idea, maybe we should go back up there again and see if there's any hint to where the blood could have gone. Because the last 2 days, we had just gone up there, and that was it. We hadn't really tried to go up there and explore around at all. At least, not to the extent we should have. So we climb back up there, and we look around more. And this time, instead of seeing a huge splatter of blood like we did before, or no blood at all, we see a small blood trail. It's kind of like a little spickle of blood, like droplets, like something or somebody was bleeding and walked a small way. We followed the blood trail. This led to a small opening in a cavern wall maybe 100 feet away. It was kind of in a rocky outcropping, so you couldn't really see it. But the hole wasn't very big, maybe 3 feet in diameter, if we had to guess, and it quickly, sharply angled down. You'd basically have to drop down into it. We had no idea what was down there, but that's where the blood had led. We figured maybe a coyote or something got hurt or injured, and this is where it jumped down into. We didn't have any flashlights, but we wanted to explore it further. As we're observing the outside, my friend tells me to shh, and we hear something. It's a person's voice in there, calling out to us, but it sounded all crackly and distorted, like it was coming from an old AM radio box or something. It was really creepy sounding. And the voice wasn't saying, "I'm in here, help me, do something." It was, "I hear you boys out there. Come in here, come in, come inside, come down." Over and over again. My friend and I were more than creeped out. So we ran away back towards where we saw the blood initially, running down the ridge, back to camp. When we got back to the campsite, we told his parents yet again, but of course they wrote us off and did not believe us. Well, that night things got a bit eventful. My friend shakes me up in the middle of the night. We are in our own tent. His parents are in the other. And we can hear screaming off in the distance. Not like any screaming I've ever heard in my life. This sounded like somebody screaming through a megaphone. Again, it kind of had that AM radio quality. Very crackly and distorted. Like they were screaming through a voice box. But it had like 2 tones into it. Like 2 voices screaming at the same time. And it was coming from the same ridge that we were at earlier in the past 3 days. I don't know what it was we almost ran into. I don't know what was down in that hole. I don't know where the blood went. But all I know is I never want to see it face to face. I would usually go camping with my family just about every spring and summer when I was a kid, all the way to being a teenager. This stopped once I turned 18 and began off to college. We would sometimes go camping 3 times a year, if my father could get the time off work, but that was not always possible. At least once a year for sure. So our story takes place in spring of 2015, a little over 3 years ago. My father was going to work one morning, and I saw a bright green light in the sky directly above him as he drove along an empty road to get to our campsite. He figured it was just a helicopter, but realized helicopters don't usually fly at night, or before dawn, which is about what would have been from his perspective. The sighting lasted about 20 seconds until he could not see it anymore, due to the surrounding homes blocking his view, and the thick timber. My dad continued on, like nothing else was said. I remember my mom made a comment about aliens, although none of us really believed her. Well, that night, however, as we're setting up our tent, I see the green light in the sky yet again, and I make a comment about it to my parents. They're quick to brush it off, as if nothing happened. And the rest of that camping trip felt very off. I would hear noises off in the distance. Sometimes it sounded like a scream. One time, I remember sitting there in my chair, crocheting, since it's a hobby I like to do. Don't judge me. And it literally sounded like an 18-wheeler had a head-on collision with a truck, maybe about 500 feet away from me. I'm just using really basic estimations here. I really have no idea how far away it was, but it sounded close by. Nobody around me, including my entire family, even seemed to notice. It was only me. The sound was so loud, I jumped up from my chair, looking around, screaming, "What was that? Did you guys hear that?" And my entire family looked at me very confused and wondering if I was having a psychotic breakdown. I wasn't. I had clearly seen it. Well, later that evening, we were doing s'mores, and I saw that green light up in the sky again. I tried to pinpoint it out to my father, but he quickly dismissed it. It's probably just a helicopter again. Gah, I can't believe people can be so daft and ignorant. Well, the rest of that small camping trip just felt very on edge. I don't want to say it was aliens, but I definitely think we had an encounter or some sort of experience with a UFO in the sky. As far as that loud crashing sound, I have no idea, but it was the equivalent to a ship or something crashing into a tree. Although, from where it sounded like, no trees are moving. There's really no way to explain that sound logically or physically, and I still don't understand why I'm the only one who had heard it. I don't know if this was a ghost or what, but we arrived at our camping site, set everything up, and got everything ready. We were eating dinner, just finishing making hot dogs and mashed potatoes. Instant mashed potatoes if you have to ask. And my wife notices a man next door, who's kind of hunched over and looks old. He smiles at us. He acted very friendly. He went back inside of his camper. Well, we finished eating dinner and just sat around the fire, having conversation. He comes back out, and now he's acting strange. He's moving very weird and kind of fidgety, but also robotic at the same time. I made a comment to my wife about it, but she just said, "Oh, well, he's probably old. Maybe he has a medical condition." And I thought to myself, yeah, maybe. Although it was very odd. He then comes out from behind his camper and walks off out towards the other end of the road. Now, a bit of information. So where our campsite was, if you go left, that leads towards where the camp host is. If you go to the right, there's another set of bathrooms, and I believe a water spigot. There was not that many people in this campground at the time. If you were to go directly ahead and not either left or right, it would lead to a smaller lake. And it's getting pretty dark out, so we see him walk off, but we're not really watching him. We're minding our own business and eating s'mores and are in conversation. Well, he's gone for quite a while. And the only reason I know this is because when he comes back, we realize how long it had been. Now, let me explain this, how it did not make any sense. I'm going to guess that it had been maybe 30 minutes. I start to see this man running our direction through the darkness, butt naked, by the way. And it's only because of the angle in which I'm sitting. My chair and where I'm facing is directly at his campsite where his trailer is, as well as the road that turns right. Behind me is the road that leads west, or towards the camp host and the entryway of the park. So I'm sitting there, facing my wife, talking to her, and out of the corner of my eye, I see this naked man running on the road. It immediately catches my attention, and I go to look, and I see it's the same old man from before. Although he's running and he's completely naked, I mean full-on birthday suit. And he almost falls and stops, landing on his knees and his hands, and begins vomiting up blood profusely, a large amount, just hacking away. My wife and I jump up from our seat, and as we go to run towards him to ask him if he's okay, he jumps up, blood and vomit all over him, and he's almost psychotic. He runs off screaming sideways into the woods towards the lake. At this point, he's disappeared, and we have no other choice but to contact the camp host, let him know what's going on. We were freaked out, but we were definitely very concerned for this old man's well-being. We have no way to understand why he was acting like this. So we hop in the car, drive down to the camp host very quickly, and of course they're not there. So we figured we'd wait around for maybe about 5 or 10 minutes, and after that long, the camp host did not reappear. We figured we'd try again later, but keep our eye on this old man. We get back in the car, drive about a minute down the road, back to our campsite. His entire camp is cleared out. No camper, no tent, nothing. And keep in mind that when we first pulled into this camp spot, he had everything set up. Everything. He had propane tanks out, he had his awning set up. I mean, it looked like the dude had been camping there for weeks. There's no way that somebody can move a camper, a fifth wheel mind you, and everything he had out in a matter of under 10 minutes. But the campsite was completely empty. Nothing. In fact, from the looks of it, there was no trace or sign there was ever anybody in that camp spot, at least any time recent. My wife and I were completely confused and startled by this, so we waited about 30 more minutes. A very nerve-wracking 30 more minutes. And in this time, remember, no sign of the crazy old man. So we get back up, go back towards where the camp host is, driving a little faster this time, even though they're only probably about 60 seconds of a drive away. They're there. We start waving our arms at them, telling them, "There's a crazy old naked dude running out by the campsite who just vomited a ton of blood. Can you help us?" Now she's freaked out and looks at her records. There's nobody who's been in that camp spot for well over 6 weeks. It's been vacant. We simply tell her that's impossible. We just pulled in earlier this evening. There was an old man there who looked like he had been there for quite a while. She just shook her head in denial. "That's impossible, sir. We go through and we check each camping spot every evening. Nobody has been in that spot for weeks." So I told her, "Come back with me. I could show you the exact spot where he vomited blood on the road." So she did, and we walked maybe about 60 feet up from our campsite on the road, where he fell onto his knees and hands and vomited blood. There was nothing there. No sign of bile, vomit, or blood. And the road, since it was mostly gravel, did not look disturbed in any way, meaning it's like this old man just never existed. So what? You're supposed to tell me that I'm supposed to believe that me and my wife just hallucinated the whole thing, that he had never existed, like we're living in some sort of alternate reality. I told the lady, and my wife saw him too. I said, "Lady, I can tell you exactly what he was wearing, what he looked like. I'm telling you what happened. I have no reason to make this up." But basically, it ended with her saying, "I don't know what to tell you. I have my paper records here, and I go through here every evening. Nobody has been here." I think the conversation ended with her being a bit annoyed at me for trying to convince her that somebody here that clearly wasn't here, judging by her records. She very politely ended the conversation and wished me a happy rest of my camping trip. My wife and I were not sure what to make of the whole thing. We were not cracked out. We did not have a history of mental illness on either of our sides of the family. We're also very young, in our later 30s. We've never hallucinated anything before in our lives. Never saw anything that wasn't there. We're both clean as a whistle. Don't drink, smoke, do drugs, nothing. And this lady's meaning to tell me that we magically just saw this old naked man running, vomit blood all over himself, and then run off screaming like a banshee. Okay. And somehow he doesn't exist. And was also somehow able to pack up and move his entire campsite, including his awning and fifth wheel, in under 10 minutes flat, without any signs of disturbance of the ground or area around him. I don't believe it. I felt like this was something straight out of the Twilight Zone. It was the 3rd day of deer season, and I was going to try my luck. This part of the state, there's a large deer population. I wanted to get to it before the season had ended. It was very snowy, and I had to be careful to leave before it got too late due to snowfall. I parked just outside the park, walking about 30 minutes in. It was snowing lightly, but I didn't mind. The snow crunched under my feet. I had not seen any deer yet, so I decided to head back to my vehicle for some time before trying again. I got close to my car and caught something. A pair of eye shine 50 feet away, glowing with a bright orange light. My first thought that it wasn't a deer, since there were not 2 little white dots like you usually see with a deer. My heart stopped as the lights on this figure stood up and began walking towards me, very slowly. I felt a moment of panic and fear come over me, and nearly slipping. The figure vanished, but I could still hear crunching footsteps coming closer, where I laid. I could feel my body shutting down from fear, and all I wanted to do was curl up tight in a ball and disappear into nothingness. I felt like I was waiting for death. I lost consciousness for about 10 minutes, got in my car and left. This sighting happened to me when I was just 16. I used to go camping with my 2 best friends, Andrew and Cameron. It was summertime in Seattle, Washington, when this took place. It was also during the day. Now, forgive me if I forget the name of the creek, but I really believe it was Rock Creek. However, I could be wrong. Anyway, we had spent a few days down there before heading back to our hometowns, since none of us lived in the same hometown, and this is the only time of year we all got to get together. It started off pretty classy. We hiked up the wrong mountain. The name is pretty ironic given its small size compared to the others in the area. After we gave up on finding the correct trail, we decided to come back and set up camp. We brought some booze along with us. Yes, our parents let us do this all by ourselves. We were all 16 and 17 at the time. Now, this part of the creek we were on is very quiet, very secluded. No trails nearby. We were off-trail hikers only. We were better than that, or so we thought. Prideful young men. We thought it would be a great opportunity to camp, get drunk, and mess around with our flashlights. Probably trying to tell stupid ghost stories, and you know how it is. We had already drank around half the day's worth of alcohol, and we were getting pretty hungry. You know what it's like to get the drunk munchies. So we headed back down where we found our campsite, and prepared some snacks and firewood. Cameron went off to collect some kind of ingredients for food. Andrew and I stayed back to start a fire. While starting a fire, I looked up at the sky as it was now beginning to get dark outside. We needed to hurry it up. But something got my attention. Over at the tree, where I initially thought I saw movement, the bark, where I thought was the bark, began moving, as if somebody had painted it white. I stared for a moment, trying to figure out what I was looking at. And it looked like the figure, or what I thought was the tree, but it turned out to be a figure behind the tree, began almost swaying and dancing. Not actually dancing, but just, that's the only way to describe the pattern of movement that I was watching. I quickly turned to Andrew and explained what I was looking at. The tree wasn't a tree at all, but an old woman, with her head in between her long bony arms, that was raised up high. She had no face, no eyes, no mouth, but had long stringy gray hair down to her waist. I don't know if we saw a demon or if this was a ghost or what, but Andrew and I ran out screaming at the top of our lungs. We did not look back. We left what little campsite we had there, ran into Cameron and told him there's a freaking demon in the woods. We needed to leave. He laughed in our faces, assuming we had just drank too much booze. But the booze we drank that day, we had drinking it all throughout the day, so we weren't in any way buzzed at this point. We said, screw you, man. You can stay here if you want, but we're leaving. But I think he got a little frightened, because we left a little ways and he screamed for us to not leave him behind. We did not look back over our shoulders once. And until this day, even my two friends, Andrew and Cameron, do not want to talk about what happened that night. My dog always came camping with me, no matter what the circumstances. I named him Buddy. I know, how original, right? But that didn't matter. He stuck with me through thick and thin. He's the reason why I was alerted to what I witnessed this night while I camped alone with him in the dark woods. I had just got up from the fire I built, and it had now burned down to having red coals. I was looking for more kindling. Lighting was tough. There was no moon outside. The only light came from the stars, and I could see everything in front of me without a problem. My eyesight wasn't all that perfect. So when I saw something move on the other side of the trees, roughly 200 feet away from me, I didn't think much of it at first, and thought it might be a bear or deer out there, so I stood still, waiting for one of them to come back into view. Maybe I could identify what it was I was looking at. Well, that's when I spotted this large black shape coming towards me, not making any noise whatsoever, while moving through the woods. It kind of just floated across and crashed into the trees, like it was gliding along. I thought it might be a person, but it took the shape of this large black garbage bag or something. This thing kind of came closer, but from where I stood, it didn't really seem to have much of a shape. It looked like this large black mass kind of just floating and bubbling through the air, and then dissipated like smoke. I don't know what it was, but it certainly scared me. It was supposed to be just an overnight stay close to where we live. We had arrived there 10 p.m. on a Friday night, October 16th. It was not the best of places for a camping trip, but it was convenient and free after all. So yeah, that wasn't bad either. We had our car parked near a small opening in the trees where two paths met. We set up camp close to the car. It was already fairly dark when I ran out of gas lanterns, so I would go restock in the morning, before the sun got too hot. I woke up around 6 a.m. on Saturday. The sun was already high in the sky. We had planned on leaving early to go to my mom's house for breakfast. I treated myself with a good cup of coffee while packing our things in the car. I took another one before leaving. It would be a long drive, over an hour, and I did not want to get too thirsty. My daughter Stephanie was in the passenger seat, and my daughter Ashley in the back. As we're driving towards my mother's house, coming out of the corner with another car on the road ahead of me, it seems that it had been forced off the road and was resting in a ditch. We slowed down, kept our eyes on the car, since we were so close to it. Strangely, we didn't hear any engine noise or see any exhaust coming from it. That's when I noticed there was nobody around. The driver door should have been wide open, due to the ditch it was in. But there were no broken windows. There was nothing that could have stopped the noise of this car's engine. Now my kids began looking around too, looking for the driver who had just abandoned their vehicle. There were also no emergency vehicles present. We all at the same time saw something very peculiar hanging from a tree to our right. A large animal, brown in color with a hairy face and big black eyes looking at us. It was not a bear. It wasn't a deer. It did not look like any kind of animal I had ever seen before. It took off immediately from the tree it was on, jumped to another one, and it took off running on the other side of the woods. We had never heard of a thing before. It looked like some kind of large ape, but definitely not an orangutan. Maybe we would have been braver if it had been daytime. We could see more things around us. Maybe somebody would have believed what we saw. I'm still amazed by this and can hardly believe it. We were not daydreaming. My kids saw the same thing I did, and we all agree on what we saw. This is when we had just come back from camping, actually. I had just went solo with my mom, and because the camping trip was easily 3 hours away from where we lived, it took quite the drive to get home. And so now, we're driving later on at night, maybe about 10:15, if I remember correctly. And off to my side of the road, which I'm in the passenger side seat, my mom is driving. We're just having conversation. And I see this tall, white, lanky figure quickly dart into the trees on the right side. It freaks me out, but I don't bother to mention anything to my mother. Of course, I know she'll just ridicule me, like she always does. Accuse me of it being my imagination. As soon as we drove past the area, this thing steps out onto the road, and my mother and I both get a full frontal view of this thing. There's no mistaking what it was. It was something from another dimension, or so I feel. My mom starts screaming and flooring the car. This thing dives out of the way, and my mom is now doing 70 miles an hour on a road that you're only supposed to be doing 45. I try to calm her down, but she tells me to shut up, and so I just sit back in the car and not say anything. So we fly home in like 40 minutes versus an hour. My mom does not say a word the rest of the night, nor did she say a word the rest of the drive home. I have no idea how to explain what it is that I saw. However, after trying to get online and do some research myself, I'm convinced that what my mother and I saw was either one of three things. A bear, which I don't think it's very likely, judging by the figure, its stature, and its coloration. I mean, where was the fur? It was not a bear. Number 2, an alien. While this seems the most plausible, it's still hard for me to even recognize as an option. And of course, number 3, Bigfoot. Again, like number 1, I don't think it really works. Aren't Bigfoot supposed to be hairy? I mean, this was lanky and hairless, and its skin was white and pale and dead-looking. Pretty sure that's not what Bigfoot looked like. I did not get a good chance to look at its face, and I'm glad I didn't. I'm not sure it's something I would want to look at. I'm 35 now. This was when I was a kid, maybe 12 or 13. I used to hang out all the time with this neighborhood kid. He kind of had a very troubled home life, so I won't really get into that. But I think his parents were pretty abusive. For a segment of time there, him and I used to play many afternoons together, and a lot of times, it involved us getting into mischief, smoking cigarettes, and even going back far into the woods, finding things and looking for stuff to make spears and things with. We built forts, we made makeshift weapons, the stuff that 12, 13-year-old boys usually do. But I can remember one time in particular that we found this old abandoned cabin or house, whatever you want to call it, that really sent a scare down our spines. I remember it was summertime, and he started telling me about how there's supposedly this haunted cabin that goes far out in the woods. I guess it used to be a house that was abandoned by a long time ago. I don't really remember all the details. And so me being 12 and 13, I thought that was just the coolest thing in the world. So I asked him to take me to it. But he told me I needed to be very careful. There's a demon that lives in the house, and if you get too close, it'll come out, pull you in, and eat your flesh. I ate up every bit of information he was telling me. So, we walked probably maybe no more than 2 miles back. I don't really remember, but I remember we had to walk along a creek and find a place where the edge to edge was more shallow so we can get over. This took a little bit of time, and every time I'd keep asking him how much further, he would just keep saying the same thing. It's not much farther now, it's right up ahead. Well, we finally came to it, and it did look like an old one-story house or cabin just casually put right here in the middle of the forest. But there were no doors, no windows. It looked in pretty bad condition. I wouldn't say it was entirely dilapidated, but it had definitely seen better days. But one thing that really made me feel creepy about the whole thing was how dark the house was. It was no later than 2 or 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and so why is the house this dark? We stood from afar, just watching the house, and he was telling me about it, how the demon lives in there, and anybody who wanders back in here, it'll take them. Then, he did what most 13-year-old boys do, dared me to go inside. Of course, I was also pumped full of adrenaline and freaked out. I refused to. Then he started doing the usual. What's wrong? Are you a chicken? And so me puffing up my chest and pretending I was brave for about 5 seconds, I said, you know what? No, I can do this. And so I promptly stood my ground, and I walked right up to that old house. Now, I got within probably about 10 feet from the front door, well, or what used to be the door. I should say the entryway, where it was pitch black inside. And I got almost right up to the door, what sounded like an incredibly large glass vase shatter all over a wooden floor. It sent me screaming and running as fast as I could. Even Chuck's face was wide-eyed and kind of pale, if I remember. And he ran after with me, back to where our houses were, and he just kept saying over and over, "The demon's real, the demon's real. There's really something in there." And well, after that, we did not end up going back. But in hindsight, with the ability to look back on this as an adult, it's not like there was this old, creepy, abandoned house in the middle of the woods, making it for a perfect haunted house story. I think this was just an old development from long ago, even though it was a ways back into the woods, with no other development around it, which I did find odd. But it wasn't so far out of the way that nobody would go back there. I could have very easily seen a homeless person living in it, or maybe an animal, maybe a squatter. It was still a structure and would still provide adequate coverage for weather or cold temperatures if you had your sleeping bag set up in there. Now, do I believe it was a demon or a ghost in there that shattered that glass? I don't. Maybe it was a person in there, maybe it was coincidence that something had fallen. Whatever it was, I don't know. But 13-year-old me seemed to think it was a demon. The memory, of course, is still creepy, and I've not gone back there ever since that day. But it would be interesting to go back there now, just to see what really became of it. Oh, and Chuck. He ended up moving about 2 years later after this, right when I started high school. I've not had contact with him since. I have no idea what he's up to, or if he's even alive. Recently, I thought I would go out after dark and traverse the night landscape, looking for anything interesting and unusual. And you bet I found just that. What I actually came across is a little bit more on the frightening side of things. I don't know how else to describe this creature, but I came across some sort of large bear-looking creature, ripping apart the carcass of a deer. I came down to a small creek and heard a noise. I followed that noise. All I had with me was my army knife and my crossbow. Not much, but enough to take down a large predator if need be. and as I approached the noise, I spotted it. This large shape that looked like a bear that was eating and ripping apart the flesh of this dead deer. And then it stood up and began using its hands the way a person would. That's when I realized I was not just watching a bear eat something, but rather an unidentified predator that I had no idea what I was dealing with. I took the loudest gulp you could and slowly began backing away. The creature stopped, instantly froze, and began lifting its head in the air to sniff, doing the usual. And I thought to myself, oh no, it smells me. It knows I'm here. But then it just casually went back down to what it was doing, digging into the flesh of this dead deer. I used that as my opportunity to turn around as quietly as I can and head back the way I came. There was nothing for me here, and I was certainly not going to be caught by that thing. Hi. I normally camp all over the Pacific Northwest, and this night was no different. I was camping up in Washington State, Skamania County to be exact. Actually, right at the Hemlock State Park and Wind River Work Center. I was with my wife, and we were walking back along the water. This was right around 8 p.m. In 2016, we had just been talking. We had been going through a very stressful portion of our marriage, and we were looking for camping as a way to kind of cure that. When we spent time together out in nature, it seemed to diffuse the heated arguments and all the stress of life. But my wife and I both saw something we're not exactly sure how to explain or put into words. She noticed it first and pointed. There was this large black shape right by the woodline. It appeared to be more of an apparition than anything. It was solid black, moving very robotically, not coming out of the woodline, but more so moving through the trees and the timber. While its movement seemed very robotic, it kind of glided. The way its legs moved did not match the movement of somebody or something walking bipedally over the branches and ground. It looked very odd. My wife and I began to get a very bad feeling just looking at this thing. We knew whatever it was could not mean anything good. We decided now was a good time to get back to our camper. When we got back, we talked about it for an hour, and that's when all the crickets around us went quiet. So we sat in our camper and sat tight. But the rest of that night, we heard some pretty strange sounds that really scared us. At one point, after all the crickets had gone silent, we could have sworn that we both heard this really heavy, raspy breathing right outside the camper, and it moved from the south all the way around to the north part of our camper, and then just went quiet. It sounded like somebody who smoked heavily, very deep, very raspy. The raspy breaths also sounded like they came from a very large set of lungs. My wife was horrified and hid in the bedroom the entire time. If anything happened, I was willing to be the protective husband and stand my ground, but I prayed and prayed I did not have to. There's no way I would match whatever could be out there. This was certainly not a bear. Bears don't do what this does. I wish I had an explanation for what it is I encountered. Thanks for listening. It was 1983, and I was in High Point State Park, New Jersey. It was actually in July. I was 26 at the time, and right around a very small lake. In fact, I wasn't even that far away from the access road that went around the lake. My camping adventure started off pretty normal, as it usually did. I set up my tent, got all my supplies together, and just sat there, enjoying the silence. No chaos, nothing. There's nothing more perfect than hearing the sounds of nature and silence. It's like it's where we were meant to be. No noise, no city life, no hustling or bustling, no people talking. It really doesn't get much better than that. Then, I began to hear a noise that I thought was a moose at first. Shows how little I know about moose. It was a noise I could not quite put my finger on, but it sounded very weird, like teeth chittering, but more of a clicking quality to it. I know that's a terrible description, but I have a really hard time pinpointing it. But the chittering or chattering went away after some time. I went to bed. The next day, I decided to hike around. And I could have sworn I came across a skull of a human, or so I thought it was. It was only part of a fragment, and it freaked me out. I don't know what it could have been, so I quickly threw it down and dismissed it altogether. I wanted no part to play if that was really the case. It already left a very bad taste in my mouth, metaphorically speaking. I decided to spend the rest of the evening back at camp, maybe reading a good book and getting lost in that. It was about 7 or 8 p.m. My fire was still going, and it was starting to get pretty dusky out. Not quite dark just yet. I heard this loud scream like I have never heard from the woods before. It sounded like a wolf howl, but very, very deep, very guttural. Whatever made it had a lot of bass in its voice. That was more than enough for me. I stayed that night, but tightly gripped my .38 pistol, ready for anything that was going to happen. The night itself remained very quiet, as if you could hear a pin drop. I was ready for just about anything. Within about an hour's time, a very, very bad storm came in, and it poured and poured until about 3 or 4 in the morning. Well, I get up the very next day, which I somehow managed to sleep through everything, and there were these massive tracks all around my campsite, leading up into the upper portion of the trees. I did not have any way to measure them, but they were longer than 12 feet, that's for sure, and you could see the indents in the wet mud where it had claws. Something very big, with a stride of over 3 feet, with claws, was walking around bipedally around my tent last night, sometime either during the storm or right after. And judging by the way they looked, it had to have been right after it stopped raining, so probably 3 or 4. I kept waking up off and on, because the rain would decrease and increase. The sound of the pitter-pattering, while relaxing to many, kept stirring me out of a light sleep. I never felt anything weird or scary, like I was being watched or stalked or potentially hunted. To this day, it stands out as easily one of the creepiest outdoors camping experiences I've ever had, and I've had many since then, but none like that.